Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII has finally been liberated from the constraints of the PSP. The original Crisis Core game was a pretty stunning title for Sony's pioneering handheld, but its 2007 era tech and gameplay design haven't aged especially well. Enter Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. Square Enix and co-developer Tosei have rebuilt Crisis Core using Unreal Engine 4 for modern consoles and PC, and the visual improvement is striking. A dramatic combat overhaul is along for the ride as well, supercharging the slower menu-based combat of the original game. So is this a worthwhile restoration of the PSP Crisis Core? And how exactly do the visuals fare when matched against 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake? With several generations of rendering technology since the original game, Crisis Core Reunion, unsurprisingly, is a much more visually mature effort than the PSP game. I'm going to run through the basic visual differences comparing the PSP code running under emulation to the PS5 version of Reunion. The original game is running at 4x resolution scale here, so we can clearly see the underlying assets and get a better sense of what the actual improvements are. Square Enix has called Crisis Core Reunion a remaster, but it's really more in line with what you would expect from a remake. The game's visuals have been fully reworked using Unreal Engine 4. That means the full suite of modern graphical staples are along for the ride, along with remodeled characters and environments. The original Crisis Core still definitely does have its charms, like its relatively detailed and expressive character models in certain cutscene sequences, but its crude environmental artwork and flat lighting don't hold up especially well. The new game has much greater geometric detail, high-res textures with normal maps and PBR properties, SSAO, SSR, per pixel lighting, depth of field, and TAA. Most of the time it basically resembles a good-looking contemporary game with a modern technology base and high-fidelity artwork. I could really spend all day playing back comparison footage here. The increase in detail and rendering quality is hugely impressive. Within the limits of the PSP's smaller screen and substandard definition resolution, the original game doesn't look bad by any means, but clearly a full overhaul was needed to get the game in respectable form at high resolutions on modern platforms. And that's exactly what Square Enix and Tosei have done. So Reunion is a comprehensive improvement over the original, but there are some clear limitations at hand as well. The basic restriction is that Crisis Core Reunion is still fundamentally Crisis Core, with the same basic framework that the original game used. For instance, most of the animation work for cinematic sequences, including camera animation, is carried over from the original game. More action-oriented cutscenes hold up pretty well, but dialogue-centric cutscenes, which mostly played out as text sequences in the original, don't look great, with rough lip-syncing and stiff character movement. The game's environments are pretty small and limited spaces, as they share level layouts with the original game. This may or may not be an issue depending on your preferences, but a lot of the original's environmental artwork has been reused here as a result. A lot of building interiors and exteriors, for instance, have been touched up with new textures and some extra geometric detail, but are broadly similar to how they looked before and appear boxy and bland. Side by side there is a large improvement of course, but they aren't quite reworked enough to stand on their own terms as assets in a modern game. On the other hand, the game's more naturalistic environments are fully redone and often look attractive, with dense meshes and a high level of detail. There's not much carried over from the original, and that's definitely for the best. There are some issues though. Shading on foliage doesn't always look great, and the grass is sorely missing an ambient occlusion pass. FMV sequences are also mostly reused from the original game. Crisis Core was interspersed with good-looking pre-rendered CG movies, although quality in retrospect wasn't especially high, given the constraints of the PSP's 480x272 resolution and low-capacity UMD game media. Video quality has been improved considerably, but these sequences still look a bit messy. And judging from the artifacting in many shots, these have probably been AI upscaled and perhaps subject to other video processing as well. In busy scenes, the results aren't great, but in relatively static shots, the picture does do a passable impression of an HG source. On the plus side, the CG used for summon attacks is fully redone and is much better than the original work. Relative to the PSP Crisis Core game though, Reunion is a huge improvement. There are a handful of elements that I do miss from the original title, like the emotive character models. But in retrospect, I don't think that the visuals have aged especially well, and the Unreal Engine 4 driven makeover is welcome. Square Enix's other remasters of PS2-era Final Fantasy titles have been gentler efforts than this, and there is definitely some merit to a light-touch approach when updating beloved older games. But I'm glad they spent the time and effort to give Crisis Core a contemporary visual transformation. And while their process wasn't flawless, I am pleased with the results on the whole. The general production values are cut above the original as well, with fully voiced dialogue, more natural, retranslated game text, and remastered music. So Reunion is a pretty good looking title compared to the original, but how does it stack up to Square Enix's blockbuster modern RPGs? Fortunately, we do have a great point of reference here in Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is another Unreal Engine based title. Across the board, the visuals are simpler in Reunion. Character models look good but are a step down, lacking the subtle shading, intricate hair, and extravagant polygon budget that lends Remake's characters their CG-like quality. Environments are sometimes bland and have less detailed artwork and lighting than is present in Remake. There are individual elements that do look similar, and raw texture detail can sometimes actually be better in Reunion, but overall the impression is that Remake is a more capable effort. And that's sort of interesting because Reunion seems to take a lot of visual inspiration from Final Fantasy VII Remake, and when Reunion showcases environments that Final Fantasy VII Remake also features, like the scaffolding around Mako reactors or the streets of Midgar, the similarities are striking. Some assets have been essentially replicated, and the lighting setups correspond closely. Reunion seems to crib heavily from Remake for these environments, and perhaps not coincidentally, these areas are the best looking zones in Reunion. In a head-to-head comparison, geometric density and asset variety aren't quite on the same level, but the results across both games are pleasing. Perhaps if Remake had featured levels on beachy coasts or dark forests, some of the less exciting areas in Reunion would look quite a bit better. Ultimately, how you evaluate Crisis Core Reunion's visuals really comes down to your point of reference. Relative to the original title, this is a far superior effort, helped of course by enormous tech and hardware improvements, but this does fall a bit short of a typical big budget modern release, with some visual holdovers from the original game and occasional lighting issues. Overall though, I am pleased with Reunion's presentation, particularly in battle sequences and in the game's Final Fantasy VII Remake inspired areas. Crisis Core Reunion is one of the most comprehensive visual overhauls that I've seen of an older title, and the results genuinely impress. On current-gen consoles, Crisis Core Reunion has a pretty straightforward setup. There's only one visual mode per console, and Square Enix states that PS5 and Series X both run at 4K at 60fps, while Series S runs at 1080p at 60fps. That's broadly correct, although I did count some sub-4K readings across PS5 and Series X. Both consoles seem to operate between 1800p and 2160p in my testing, though there is a possibility that they could go lower. Both consoles look very similar and tend to hit roughly the same resolution figures in matching shots. Series S, on the other hand, did count in at 1080p in all shots in my testing, so dynamic res seems rarer or absent on that machine. All current-gen hardware targets 60fps, and in my testing, all of them lock perfectly to that target. There's no drama whatsoever here. All gameplay and real-time cutscenes run at a perfect 60fps. Crisis Core does have some pre-rendered content, of course, and this plays back at 30fps with consistent frame pacing. In terms of visual settings, all current-gen consoles seem identical outside of resolution, with Series X and PS5 resolving a much clearer picture than Series S. It's hard not to be pleased with the general showing on these consoles. Every version is running about as well as you could reasonably expect. But that's far less of a given for the Nintendo Switch. Yes, there is a version of Crisis Core Reunion for Nintendo's hybrid console. Unreal Engine titles often prove very taxing on Switch, with pared back, muddy visuals, and I was worried that we would see a repeat with this title. So how does it actually fare? Surprisingly, this is an excellent build. Very few elements of Reunion's visual makeup have been lost in translation. All the key rendering features are here, including a surprisingly crisp rendition of screen space reflections, which is a rarity on Switch. Gamma configurations on Switch do seem to differ somewhat from the PS5 release, so expect to see a darker picture on Switch throughout these comparisons. Broadly speaking, the game looks similar to the full-fat current-gen experience, with just a few key cutbacks. There are some fairly minor differences in the quality of certain environmental assets. Rocky outcroppings and high-frequency texture work appear simplified on Switch, though most shots in the game look pretty similar across current-gen consoles and Switch. Plus, foliage density takes a significant hit, with pared back grass across a range of naturalistic environments. The resolve of certain post-process effects can be a little bit messy. Screen space reflections, for instance, are applied across all the same materials as the higher-end consoles, but the SSR ends up looking a bit too noisy on some objects to really be useful. In portable mode, this is a particularly noticeable issue, with character movement frequently exposing artifacts that are generated by screen space effects. Depth of field quality is also reduced somewhat, though this only really stands out in side-by-side shots. There's also one significant visual cutback that applies broadly across a lot of different areas. The game's real-time shadow maps, which are mostly used for character and enemy models, are absent in many of the outdoor zones. Interiors usually retain them, but in outdoor areas it's a mixed bag. Some areas do have shadow maps, but many lack them. But Reunion uses baked shadows for static environmental features, so most of the shadow detail is perfectly intact on Switch. Plus, the dynamic shadows have been replaced with a different shadowing technique, which looks to me like an implementation of capsule shadows. In some conditions, I think the capsule shadows actually look better than the shadow maps that we see on the more powerful platforms. So this apparent downgrade is actually pretty easy to stomach. The final cut inevitably is rendering resolution. Crisis Core Reunion targets 720p in docked mode, though there is dynamic resolution that can take the game down to about 576p at lowest, with most pixel counts falling somewhere between these 2 points. There does appear to be some form of upsampling in effect, probably Unreal Engine's TAAU, so still shots have a 720p-like resolve regardless of the internal resolution. There's a good chance TAAU is present on the higher-end consoles as well, though it's much easier to notice here as the resolution window is pretty large. Portable mode again targets 720p, though the lower bound is reduced considerably here, down to a minimum of 432p in my testing. Again, the image is reconstructed to a higher res resolve, which does do a good job of giving the game a 720p-like image in still shots. In motion, there are a lot of aliasing artifacts, but the overall impression is definitely of a much more detailed game than the typical resolution, which is usually around 504p or so, would imply. Reunion's performance unfortunately does let down the quality of the Switch port somewhat. Superficially, the framerate numbers do look good, and Reunion generally hits and maintains 30 FPS. Frame pacing is pretty messy though. Expect to see a mix of 16, 33, 50, and 66 millisecond frames in general play, instead of the stable 33 millisecond pacing that we really should be getting. In docked play, this is a serious annoyance, though I did find it somewhat easier to forgive on the Switch's built-in display in portable mode, though your mileage may vary. Outside of the pacing issue, Reunion is close to a locked 30 FPS, which makes the pacing problem all the more unfortunate. I noticed only a few occasions with unambiguous performance drops that were unrelated to frame pacing. There's also no motion blur in Crisis Core Reunion, so the pacing problems stand out here more than they would in other games. If the frame pacing issue can be solved, this will be a top-flight conversion, as basically every other aspect of this port is very well calibrated. The game leans heavily on dynamic resolution and upsampling to shoulder 8th gen rendering technology without ruining image quality or hacking away at visual settings. There are a range of small visual cuts to ease rendering load, but they aren't obnoxious and the visual fallbacks are reasonable, including a clever use of capsule shadows. Most Switch versions of modern software aren't nearly as graceful. Reunion is an excellent looking Switch game, and even with the frame pacing annoyances, this is a good portable experience, but it's so close to being just about perfect. An update to fix the pacing issues, which may be a simple matter of swapping in a different framerate cap with a few lines of code, would vastly improve the experience. Crisis Core Reunion's visual upgrade is impressive and the game runs well on a variety of platforms. But the changes aren't just skin deep. Reunion plays totally differently from the PSP original. On the surface, the fundamental systems don't seem too different. All the basics are present and accounted for. You can dodge, attack, block, and cast spells and special abilities. The slot machine-style digital mind wave also returns, triggering gameplay bonuses that shake up combat encounters. But the game has been overhauled with combat mechanics taken from Final Fantasy VII Remake, which feels quite fitting as the original Crisis Core directly inspired Remake's combat systems. The basic attack has been updated with a snappy new slash sequence, and dodges have been sped up. Crisis Core's menu-based combat interface has been replaced with a more tactile hotkey system that maps all gameplay actions onto the face buttons. Enemy behaviors have been overhauled, with more rapid attack patterns and new abilities. The digital mind wave is also reworked, with more frequent gameplay boosts and manually triggered limit breaks. And of course, the camera system from the original game has been modernized with right stick camera control, a big improvement from the shoulder button based camera of the original PSP game. Though the original Crisis Core felt pretty solid 15 years ago, it feels quite clunky today with a messy menu system and stilted attack mechanics. Reunion has much more satisfying action and almost feels like an all-new game. It's not enormously complex or anything, enemy attack patterns are still fairly simple and clearly telegraphed, and the slot machine mechanics remain sort of pleasantly ridiculous, but the final result gels really nicely. The remake-style character handling combines with the spell system and random bonuses from the original game to produce a frenetic, exciting action RPG. It's hard to walk away from Crisis Core Reunion without feeling impressed. The graphical overhaul is a big success, with fully modernized visuals that aren't perfect but are an enormous improvement, making the game look fit for purpose in 2022. The game's core combat systems are transformed and the moment-to-moment action feels great. And the game works well on a broad range of console platforms, including the Switch. I really enjoyed my time with Crisis Core Reunion, and it comes highly recommended. This is a comprehensive reworking that succeeds on just about every level. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.